Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. On behalf of the National Transit Institute, I welcome you and thank everyone for participating. The National Transit Institute develops, promotes, and delivers training and education programs for the public transit industry in the United States. Today's webinar is NTD reporting for subrecipients for report year 2020. Today we are pleased to have as our presenters Bailey Krause and Melissa Conte. Melissa Conte joined the NTD team in 2015. She is a graduate of James Madison University and currently works as a senior validation analyst across urban and rural reporting modules of the National Transit Database. Bailey Krause joined the NTD team in 2014. She is a graduate of Michigan State University and currently serves as the validation manager for the National Transit Database Rural Reporting Mode. During today's presentation, you can ask a question at any time, preferably by typing it into the Q&A box. If you don't see the Q&A box option in your Zoom controls at the bottom of the screen, you might be able to hit more ... and see if it comes up there. It's easier to keep track of your questions. It's easier to see which questions get answered. I know it's tempting to put the questions in the chat box, but sometimes they get lost if there's a lot of chatting going on, which doesn't happen all the time, but sometimes. So you should have also received a copy of the handouts of today's presentation. It was emailed to you with a link, a downloadable link. I will also be pasting that in the chat box so that you can access it. I think that covers all the housekeeping. I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Melissa.
Great. Thanks, Lori, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today for the 2020 subrecipient training presentation. As Lori mentioned, if you have any questions as we go through the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A feature that she just went over, so we can answer those during the presentation, and then if we have any questions we want to handle offline, we'll reach out to you personally if we want to discuss that, or if your analyst should be kept in the loop for those questions. All right, so here's the contact information for the National Transit Database. If at any point you require technical assistance while accessing our published data products, you can feel free to call or email our help desk line. We're open from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern Time. For any technical assistance while completing your NTD report in the reporting system, you can reach out to your state DOT contact for assistance with that. So my name is Melissa Conte, and I'm joined here today by Bailey Krause, our Rural Validation Manager, and she will be presenting the latter half of this presentation. Our contact information is listed here in case you have any questions about the presentation. Here's the agenda for this afternoon. So first we're going to do a quick overview of the NTD, or National Transit Database, and then we're going to move on to some important changes and clarifications for the 2020 report year. Then we will review the fundamentals of NTD reporting, and we will discuss how to get started in the NTD 2.0 reporting system, briefly review some interface changes for this year, and then we're going to move on to how to complete the annual report, and we'll also be reviewing some common reporting challenges. The last portion of this presentation will be reviewing the closeout and validation process for the NTD report. Okay, so first a quick overview of the National Transit Database. Oops, I went a little far ahead there, sorry about that. So what is the National Transit Database, or what we refer to as the NTD? So the NTD was established to be the nation's primary source for information and statistics on all public transit modes in the United States. It's a source for data performance measure benchmarking as well as research. Recipients and subrecipients of Chapter 53 funds report to the NTD. Subrecipients of State 5311 funds report data through their state DOT NTD report. These subrecipients may include those who have received funding in the past and are still required to report based on continuing grant requirements, or it may be those that wish to receive it in the future and report voluntarily. 5311 recipients and subrecipients are required to report due to grant requirements as stated here by the federal legislation. Data from the NTD is used for several things. Some examples include performance benchmarking, research and statistic programs, formula apportionments for funding, and reports for Congress as seen here on the slide. NTD data is due on the following dates of October 31st, January 31st, and April 30th, depending on an agency's fiscal year end. Your individual state DOT may have some internal deadlines that subrecipients must meet before the state's submission due date. So please reach out to your state DOT if you have questions on when you need to complete your NTD report. Okay, so next we're going to dive into some changes and clarifications for the 2020 report year that may affect your report. With COVID-19, we understand many agencies may have been providing additional services such as emergency services or non-passenger services such as meal delivery. Emergency services or response to a natural disaster do not meet the FTA definition of public transportation and are not reportable to the NTD. Non-passenger services such as meal delivery also do not meet the FTA definition for public transportation and should not be included on the NTD report. In the event that your agency received Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act funds or CARES Act funds, you will need to report these as a separate item on the Reduced Reporting RR20 form. There will be a new line for these funds under the federal funding section of the form. For any fleets that were added to your transit agency's services during the year, the seating capacity should be reported as the normal operating standards pre-COVID-19. You should not update any seating capacities to reflect temporary changes in capacity due to the pandemic. Any Medicaid funding of non-emergency medical transportation or NEMT service should be reported as an organization paid fare on the RR20 form. Previously, these funds would have been reported under state funds or other federal funds, depending on the original source. For financial reporting, agencies are required to report the final source used to pay for the cost of an expense. You should not report the interim financing mechanism, typically local funds, that you may use. In the event that your agency has pre-award authority for an FTA grant, you should report the expenses as that particular FTA grant, even if the reimbursement has not yet been completed. New in report year 2020, there are some new types of service in the NTD. There are the existing types of directly operated or DO service and purchase transportation general or PT. However, there are two new types of purchase transportation. We have purchase transportation taxi or TX and purchase transportation network company or TN. Purchase transportation types of service are now determined by the type of entity that is under contract. Next is the clarification on those transportation network companies or TNCs. If you are reporting to the NTD and contracting with a TNC or on-demand service, and the service is considered public transit, you must include the data in this service in your NTD report. As mentioned on the slide, the contract between your agency and the TNC or Transportation Network Company must meet the criteria for purchase transportation as defined in the NTD policy manual. We will go over what public transportation means in a few minutes. So the TN or Transportation Network Company type of service is a service provided by a TNC on behalf of a public transportation agency. The service must meet requirements for purchase transportation and be open to the public. Agencies reporting on this mode may be asked for a description of services as needed. The TX or taxi type of service is purchase transportation service provided by a taxi company. This was previously captured under the DTPT mode and would now be captured as DRTX with the new service requirements. The NTD system will automatically change any existing DTPT modes to the DRTX type of service for report year 2020. Demand response taxi services are operated by a commercial taxi company for a public transportation agency. In cases where an agency contracts with a taxi provider to perform ADA service using dedicated vehicles, the portion of their service with dedicated vehicles would be reported as DRPT, and any portion that uses non-dedicated vehicles would be reported as DRTX service. A reminder for the 2020 report year, pilot programs are not considered public transit and should not be reported to the NTD. Public transit must be regular and continuing to be reportable to the NTD, and therefore pilot programs and any ad hoc services do not qualify. For any state DOTs with self-reporting subrecipients, there is a change to the user manager process for the 2020 report year. State DOT users are now the user managers of the subrecipient users. Previously, each subrecipient with self-reporting privileges would have their own user managers. This was removed over the summer, and the user manager privileges now fall to the state DOT. The state DOT will be able to create and remove subrecipient accounts as needed. If you have any questions about your user account or need to add new accounts or remove accounts, you should contact your state DOT. Okay, so now we're going to jump into a review of the NTD Fundamentals, where we're going to cover modes, types of service, revenue service definitions, and a quick overview of financial information. When reporting to the NTD, the service must be public. Once that is determined, the mode comes next. Here on the slide are the most common modes in the rural module: demand response and bus. Bus service is powered by a motor and fuel contained within a vehicle. It includes those that have route deviation, point deviation, or deviated fixed route service. Demand response service is defined as service scheduled in response to calls from passengers like dial a ride. Another popular mode in the rural module is the commuter bus mode. We receive many questions on what is considered commuter bus service versus regular bus service. To clarify this, commuter bus operates with more than 5 miles of closed-door service, and the same type of vehicles are consistently operated on the service. If you think that you may have both bus and commuter bus service, please keep in mind that the vehicles shouldn't be used between the services on the same day, and this also applies to the driver work assignments, which are typically separate. If you are currently reporting both commuter bus and bus service, and you believe you may only need to be reporting one mode, please contact your state DOT for assistance, and we can help them determine how it should be reported and provide steps on how to change this in the reporting system if appropriate. The next topic we'll cover is going to be the types of service. Currently in the NTD, there are the 2 main types of service that we briefly covered a couple of slides ago. We have directly operated and purchase transportation. Directly operated service is when the service is operated by the agency and uses the agency's employees. Purchase transportation is when the vehicles are operated by the seller's employees, the service is branded as the buyer, and the buyer is paying the full cost of service. As mentioned earlier in this presentation, there are the 2 new types of purchase transportation types of service. We have TX for services that are operated by a taxi provider, and TN for services that are operated by a transportation network company, or TNC. If the service is simply operated by a contractor that is neither a taxi provider nor a TNC, the type of service would remain PT or purchase transportation. After the mode and type of service has been determined, the next question is what data should you be collecting for these services? Here are some data points listed here on the slide, as well as the abbreviations that are used throughout this presentation and also on the report. The data points are collected on a per mode and type of service basis, except for sponsored unlinked passenger trips, which are only collected for demand response modes. These are going to be common acronyms that you will see throughout all of our NTD materials. We will first cover vehicle revenue miles, or VRM, and vehicle revenue hours, or VRH. We will talk a lot about revenue service. So what does that mean? Revenue service is going to be when vehicles are transporting passengers or are able to transport passengers. This includes layover and recovery time. Revenue service does not include deadhead, driver training, school bus or charter services, or vehicle maintenance. As mentioned on the previous slide, deadhead is not reported in your revenue service. This includes leaving or returning to the garage or yard facility, changing routes, or when there is no expectation of carrying passengers. There are detailed tables that can be found in the NTD policy manual, which provide further examples of what is and is not considered revenue service. We are going to review a couple of these next. So here is the example for the demand response mode of what is and is not considered revenue service. Please note that the time and miles from when the vehicle is dispatched from the garage to pick up a passenger are not considered revenue service until they reach the pickup point. On the end of that example, the time and miles from the last drop-off back to the dispatching point is also not considered revenue service. As a follow-up to the previous slide, here is the example for our bus mode of what is and is not considered revenue service. Again, from the garage to the first stop of the route is not considered revenue service, and from the last drop-off point back to the garage is also not considered revenue service. Both of these two tables on the last two slides can be found in our policy manual and may be helpful to review if you have questions as to what to include for revenue service. Unlinked passenger trips, or UPT, should represent the number of passenger boardings during the reporting period. Passengers are counted each time they board the vehicle, no matter how many vehicles they use from their origin to their destination. When reporting unlinked passenger trips, please include all passengers. These passengers are usually classified as regular or sponsored. When reporting unlinked passenger trips on the RR20 form, this should be the total number of passenger trips, both regular trips and sponsored. For demand response, you will report sponsored trips as a subset of the total. Sponsored trips are trips that are paid in part or in full by a third party. These may be part of a coordinated human services transportation plan. Common sponsors are the VA, Medicaid, and assisted living centers. As mentioned on the last slide, sponsored UPT should be reported as a subset of the total unlinked passenger trips for all demand response modes. Vehicles operated at annual maximum service, or VOMs, are the number of vehicle revenue vehicles an agency operates to meet the annual maximum service requirement. VOMs are counted during the peak season of the year on the busiest day, but you will want to ensure that you exclude any atypical days or special events. This count should include any volunteer vehicles that were used in maximum service. This shouldn't be the amount of active vehicles your agency has in service, but rather how many vehicles are used at once during peak service. Another important definition is accrual accounting. NTD reporting requirements for financial data follow generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP, and accrual accounting. If there are conflicts between GAAP and NTD reporting instructions and requirements, the NTD rules are to be followed. In accrual accounting, the revenue is recorded when earned, regardless of when the payment is received, and expenses are recorded when the liability occurs, regardless of when the payment is made. Please see the examples here on the slide, and also there are a couple examples in our policy manual for further detail. Next, we will review the types of expenses. First, we have operating expenses. Operating expenses are the day-to-day expenses that a transit agency incurs. These may be for operating and maintaining vehicles, maintaining other equipment, planning costs, administration costs, as well as other examples seen here on the slide. Capital expenses are those that are related to the purchase of equipment. Equipment means an article of non-expendable personal property having a useful life of more than 1 year. The equipment will have an acquisition cost, which equals the lesser of the capitalization level established by the government unit for financial statement purposes, or $5,000 as determined by FTA. Lastly, for the expenses category, we'll cover capital assistance spent on operations. This is when capital funding is spent on activities that are normally considered operating, such as preventative maintenance and the purchase of tires. Please be sure to break this out from your other operating funding, as this has a different match percentage. There is a separate field for this on capital assistance spent on operations on the RR20 form for certain funding sources, such as 5311. For operating expenses, if your agency has more than 2 modes, the operating costs or expenses will be broken out between the 2 modes based on direct and shared expenses. Once the direct expenses for each mode are identified and broken out, the remaining shared expenses may be calculated between the modes based on an allocation method. Please note that that allocation is only acceptable for shared expenses. There should be some expenses that are directly attributable to each mode. When reporting your data to the NTD, you will report the funding you spent, not the amount your agency was awarded. Here on the slide is an example of this. If your agency was awarded $275,000, but you only spent $178,000, you would be reporting the $178,000 instead of the $275,000 that was awarded. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, here is a quick overview of the Transit Asset Management Rule, or TAM rule. Those who receive Chapter 53 funds and either own, operate, or manage capital assets used in the provision of public transportation services are required to report data for their assets. For recipients of 5310 B1D, if they do not provide public transit services, they are not required to report under the TAM rule. With regards to how this data is reported, for those in a sponsored state DOT TAM plan, you will report the assets associated with the plan on the individual subrecipient packages. However, the targets and narrative report for the TAM plan will come from the state DOT. States may have Tier 2 participants as part of their Transit Asset Management or TAM plan, and these will most likely consist of 5311, 5310, and small urban providers. The state will report data on behalf of managed participants, such as the 5311 and 5310 asset-only providers, or they may designate self-reporting privileges, while urban reporters will submit their own asset data directly in their own NTD report. Data submission will work as it has previously, with the state being the one to submit the report on behalf of its managed subrecipients and participants. We will mention capital responsibility multiple times throughout this presentation with regards to the expanded asset module. Please see here the list to determine whether or not an agency has direct capital responsibility for an asset. As a note for the third bullet point, an infrastructure asset itemized as a capital line item in the budget does not necessarily mean an agency has direct capital responsibility. An agency must also have management and oversight responsibilities for the line item project. In addition, performing minimal preventative maintenance work does not necessarily indicate direct capital responsibility. Please see here for a list of key reference documents for the NTD report. Included here we have the glossary and annual reporting user guide, as well as the Uniform System of Accounts, or USOA, that was updated in 2018. There are also additional resources related to COVID-19 and the Transit Asset Management Rule on the page that's linked at the bottom of this slide. Next, we will review the NTD interface and account user management. Self-reporting subrecipients have the ability to enter and edit data for their forms. This privilege is granted by the state DOT and is completely optional and at the state DOT's discretion. While self-reporting subrecipients can edit and save forms, the state DOT is the one who will submit the report. Subrecipients should contact the state DOT for any questions or technical assistance needed while completing the report. All correspondence with the NTD analyst should go through the state DOT contact to ensure that everybody is kept in the loop and is on the same page. The NTD homepage is found here at www.transit.dot.gov/NTD. This is where data products, policy manuals, and other reference materials can be found, as well as a clickable link to go directly to the reporting system. After logging in and following the login instructions that we'll go over in a moment, all users will land on a new homepage. The Appian platform, which houses both the National Transit Database and TRAMS, recently deployed a new landing page. Here you will select NTD in order to access your report. If you would like to automatically go into the NTD site every time you log in, you can click on the star icon at the top right of the NTD box, and that will save your preference. The new NTD homepage now allows users to directly access their NTD report from the front page. You will no longer see the news feed as you have in previous years. Next is the Tasks tab. If you do have any tasks assigned to you, this section was updated with a new layout, but it will still look the same in terms of keeping all of your tasks in a list for you. To access your annual report packages, you will want to ensure that you're first on the home page. From here, you'll select the Annual tab, and it will populate any open NTD reports for your agency. You can access the forms in one of two ways. You can either click on the NTD ID with the folder icon on the left side, which will direct you to the report package summary page. This route will also allow you to access the related actions for the package. If you would only like to go in and edit the forms, you can click on the pencil icon on the right side of the page, and the system will take you directly to a clickable list of all of the forms in order to edit. To access the reporter profiles, you will still want to ensure that you are on the home page or the home tab. Instead of clicking on Annual, you will select Profile, and your agency's profile will load. The profile is where you will edit your mode, agency basic information, as well as view other users from your agency. These are going to be the forms that do not typically change year to year. In order to view the individual profile forms, you will click on the pencil icon on the right side of the page, which will allow you to access the P10, P20, etc. To access other profile options, click on the NTD ID folder icon on the left. Once you click on the NTD ID folder icon on the left side, you will then see the profile summary page as you have in previous years. Here you can go through related actions to edit the profile forms or P forms. Next on the profile is going to be your e-file library. This is where you can filter through communications from prior years as well as the current report year. The form library is also accessible through the profile, and this is where you can see data from previous years that has been submitted to NTD. You will use the drop-down to select the package and then the link in blue for whichever form you would like to download. When you download these, they will be in an HTML format. In addition to viewing the forms, under the Related Actions tab of the profile, you will be able to print previous year's report packages in full rather than form by form, as just shown in the form library. Other actions you can complete is viewing and editing the profile forms, the P10 or your basic information, the P20 form or your modes form, and the P30, which is your user form to review any users for your agency. If you choose to print your annual report package, you will be taken to a new page where you can click on the refresh button until the link comes up for you to download the file. Here on this slide, once the file is ready and you click refresh, you'll then be redirected to the previous page. And here by the red arrow is where you can see there will be a downloadable link where you can click on that, and the file with all of your forms in one file will be able to, you can download it to your computer and save it or print as needed. To reset your password, if you have any issues logging into the system, you will go to the reporting homepage and click on the Forgot Password link. Then you will fill out your username, which will be your full email address associated with your account in all lowercase letters. You will then click Send Email, and you'll receive an email with a link that is active for 15 minutes only. Upon clicking that link that you receive in your email, you will then be able to reset your password. If you are already a user in the system and need to unlock your account, there are two different ways to complete this. You can either unlock your own account if you have set up security questions, which we'll go over in the next slide, or you can submit an unlock request. If you submit an unlock request, the request will go to the user managers at the state DOT. It is important to note that even if you're locked out, you still can log into the NTD reporting system. However, the reports and other features of the website will not be available to you until you are unlocked using one of those two options above. As I mentioned, if you have set up those security questions beforehand, you can unlock yourself using those. If you haven't set them up yet, you can set up your questions by going to the top right-hand corner of your screen after you log in, and you'll select Profile, then select Related Actions, and then select Manage Security Questions. Then from there, you will be able to follow the steps on the website to set up those security questions if you'd like to use those to unlock yourself in the future. So next, that's it for me. I'm going to next hand it over to Bailey, and she's going to start to review completing the NTD forms.
Excellent. Thank you, Melissa. As she just mentioned, we will now be going over how to complete the 2020 annual report as a subrecipient. First off, a rural general public transit subrecipient, or RGPT, is an agency that provides rural service and benefits from 5311 funding or is reporting through the useful life of a 5311 funded asset. A standard RGPT reporter will have about 6 forms to complete, as listed right here. The data is split into basic information forms, asset forms, and the RR20, which is a combination of the financial, safety, and in-service data. The first step in working on the report is getting to the package by selecting your NTD ID from the home page, as seen here and as Melissa went over earlier. You are able to also search for the NTD ID of the sub if you have more than one subrecipient that you're working on, or search the name if you have access to more than one report, which some of you may. To edit the forms, you can click on either the annual forms in the top right-hand corner of the screen, or you can click on the related actions and then view annual forms, but we're going to go ahead and just click on the annual forms for this. This will bring you to a new page where you'll be able to select each form to edit. As you can see, the forms are now in that blue font, so that means you can click on them. Okay, so the first form that we're going to talk about is the Basic Information B10 form, which contains an agency's organization type and fiscal year. You'll be able to edit the data from the summary page by using the drop-down to select the organization type. This data should be pre-filled if you submitted a report last year. However, if this is your first year reporting and you're a brand new subrecipient, this will need to be filled out before you can submit the report. And then also you'll be filling in the fiscal year end date. Also should be preloaded, but if not, please update it. Please enter the date for which the data is based on. This may be different from your state's fiscal year depending on how you're reporting data and how they're reporting data. And then when you're finished with this form, you can go ahead and select Save and Validate at that bottom in the blue, which is highlighted right now. So quick form. Next, we're going to go ahead and discuss the A10, which is the Stations and Maintenance Facilities form. And this will start the reporting of all the asset forms that we're going to be talking about. The A10 captures the type and number of maintenance facilities utilized for public transit and are reported based on the ownership types of those maintenance facilities. So this is an example of a directly operated, which you'll see the owned, leased from another public agency or leased from a private entity. The purchase transportation forms, however, will have different subtypes. So if you do have questions on where your agency fits in with that, just let your analyst know or let your state know if you are a subrecipient listening in to me right now. Please note that you will not include the bus barns that you may have in your asset pool in this count, or any third-party facility where you would take your vehicle to get work done, like a Jiffy Lube or a Muffler Man. All right, so say you have a bus mode and you also have a demand response mode. So if the one facility is shared by 2 or more modes, you'll want to report the prorated share between the modes involved. So this could be based on any data point that is reflective of how much the facility is used per mode. But the one common approach we see is based on the number of vehicles it services. So for example, an agency owns one facility and operates a demand response and a fixed route bus service, or just a bus mode for this example. Both modes share the facility and they own 20 vehicles total. So the demand response mode runs 15 of them, and then the bus mode runs 5. So in this example, we would see 0.75 reported in the demand response mode form, and then 0.25 in the bus form. Either way, it just needs to make sure that it's a full integer value. We don't want to see 1.11 or 100. Make sure it's in the decimal points, and you're not reporting 75 facilities and then 25 facilities. Other than that, just make sure it's a whole integer. All right, so next, we're going to jump into the facilities inventory form. So we went through the A10, now we're going through the A15. The A15 form collects basic information on facilities that are used to supply public transit service. If your agency does not have any facilities, the form needs to be saved and validated as blank, regardless of whether or not you've filled it in every single year blank. Go ahead, save and validate as blank again. On this form, you're going to report administrative and maintenance facilities for which you have the capital responsibility for, as Mel mentioned earlier. However, you'll want to report the passenger and parking facilities regardless of whether or not you have capital responsibility for them. When I'm talking passenger and parking facilities, I am talking about those big structures. I'm not talking about like an overhang or a bench. So that's what we're looking for here. And please note, if your agency has owned a maintenance facility on the A10, we usually expect them to have a facility entered on this form if that facility is used more than incidentally for the service that you are reporting to us. There's more detail in the policy manual about this if you do have any additional questions as well. But to go ahead and fill out that A15, you're going to first click on the Add New button and then Add Facility link shown by the handy-dandy arrow. This will allow you to enter the data for the facility. You'll complete the 3 sections that require information in regards to the facility, such as the mode it services, the type, the year built, the square foot, information like that. The condition assessment of the facility, as well as the address of the facility. The information is pre-populated from the prior year, so if you've already done it last year, you won't have to do it again. Just go ahead and save and validate. Make sure everything's up to date. If you do have a new condition assessment, make sure that's updated as well. So we do expect to see 75% of those condition assessments this year. Just as a note overall, if you have your own TAM plan or if you are part of your states, you may have to enter that this year versus the prior year. All right, the next form is the A30. This is where you're going to report your revenue vehicle inventory data, which is categorized in fleets. If you completed this form last year's data will pre-populate again. We're trying to make it a little easier. You'll only need to report the new fleets or edit any existing fleets. If you went through it and you're like, wait, this actually has 6 seats, not 5. You can make those edits. You will be asked about those edits if you do make them. But if you do need to add any new fleets, you're going to click on that Add New Fleet button, or you can edit an existing fleet by clicking on Edit Existing Fleet. And you're just going to click on that blue RVI ID link if you choose to edit them. While adding a new fleet, you'll want to fill out all the required information, which is notified by those little blue stars on the left-hand side. The vehicle type will be what the vehicle is, for example, a van, cutaway, or a bus. The total vehicle state how many total vehicles that there are in a fleet, which will exactly match in all ways. So the funding type, the seating capacity, the length, everything needs to match. The active fleet vehicles are how many vehicles are active as of the last day of the fiscal year that you are reporting on. And then the next important data point is the no capital responsibility field. So this field will only be checked if you do not have any capital replacement responsibility for the vehicle. Checking off this box will remove the requirement for reporting a useful life benchmark for the fleet, and it will remove it from either your own TAM plan or your state's TAM plan's percentages. So a common question that we received is, what is the difference between an active and inactive vehicle? Transit agencies must report the number of active vehicles in the fleet as of the end of the fiscal year. I know I stated that already, but active vehicles provide the regular service and include spare vehicles. Inactive vehicles are those that are awaiting sale or disposal, are in storage, or are a part of an FTA-approved emergency contingency plan, or are out for major repair. So basically, if you are able to use it and it's a spare, or you could pull it up, you will want to report it as an active vehicle. All right, following up on the previous slide. So there are active and inactive vehicles, and also there are retired vehicles. So please remember to retire vehicles that are no longer in service rather than deleting them. Fleets should only be deleted if they were added to the mode incorrectly. So to retire a fleet, you will go ahead and update that active vehicles to 0, as I mentioned earlier. And then once that update occurs, a question appears in like the lower right-hand corner of the screen, which is this fleet retired? You will select yes to that. Please note, do not edit a fleet that was disposed of with information of a new fleet. This will just kind of make all the data appear a little weird. This gives the same RVI ID number, which if we are looking at from year to year data, it just will cause a little confusion. If that fleet is disposed of, please retire it as mentioned before, and then add the new one. New RVI ID, just a little bit more work, but overall it'll just be a little easier with validation for you. All right, the next form is the Service Vehicle Inventory form, or A35, is where we collect an inventory of service vehicles that are used to indirectly deliver transit service. So when I say that is your agency is required to report on vehicles for which you have capital responsibility again, just like A30, but service vehicles will include cars used for admin staff, transit police cars, and tow trucks. However, you should not report the forklifts, golf carts, those ones. This form will work the same exact way as the A15. To create a fleet, you'll select Add New. As mentioned a moment ago, this is where service vehicles are used to indirectly deliver transit service. So if a revenue vehicle also indirectly, performs transit service, you're only going to report it as a revenue vehicle. So if that same car that you're using in transit service is also used as, an admin car here and there, report it on your A30. You need to capture it in the A30 versus the A35, so there should be no duplicates between the A30, A35. And if your agency does not have any service vehicles, just like the A15, you need to save and validate it as the link. So in the A35, the first section is the fleet or service fleet information, and it includes the fleet name, which will be what the agency calls it, the agency fleet ID associated with the vehicle, primary mode, any secondary modes, type of vehicle, number of vehicles, useful life benchmark of the vehicle, manufacturer year notes. There are 3 types of vehicles that this includes, which is automobiles, trucks and other rubber-tired vehicles, and steel wheel vehicles. If your agency does have more than one mode, the primary mode should be the mode that the fleet vehicle service the most, and this is at the agency's discretion, of course. The second and final section of the A35 is the financial area. The fleet name and the fleet ID will carry over from the first section. Then the agency, or you, will fill out the transit agency capital responsibility percentage, the estimated cost, and the year's dollars of estimated cost. Estimated cost will be the most recent estimate of the full cost to replace the asset. And if you do not have a recent estimate, you can go ahead and report the original cost of the asset or the insured value. If you don't have it or you don't have the insured value, you can report the original cost of the asset, but you would make sure you would report the year that you purchased that asset so you can kind of compare it. When all information is entered and you're on the summary page, you can go ahead and click on Save and Validate. And those are the typical A forms for a subrecipient. However, I will be going over the A90 very briefly after the RR20, as most of you guys do not have to fill that out as a subrecipient. So, on the RR20 form, this is going to contain the rest of the report basically for you. On last form, the RGPT package usually fills out if you're not reporting on your own TAM plan. Okay. When you open up the RR20 form, the total funds expended is at the top of the form, which is the non-editable running total of the funds that you are entering. This should match the total funds expended by mode and type of service that you will manually enter as shown here in the red circles. As a reminder, finances should be reported as revenues that were expended during the fiscal year, not earned. So as you can see, the red operations match 150, 150, capital matches 75,000, 75,000. So that's what this form is looking for. If these do not match, a validation issue will fire that says they do not match. There are certain circumstances in which they may not match. However, most of the time, they will definitely match. Okay, on to it. So agencies with more than one mode are required to capture and report actual expenses by mode and type of service. and not allocate the total amount of expenses. So if you do have more than one mode, you'll want to determine which expenses are direct and can be easily traced to a specific mode, which may include driver wages or vehicle repairs. For the remaining expenses that are joint expenses, which are the costs that are incurred for the benefit of more than one mode and cannot be traced, you can go ahead and allocate those remaining costs. So an example of this may be a transit manager's salary that supports both demand response and the bus mode. You may allocate those joint expenses or shared costs to each mode by an allocation factor such as vehicle revenue miles, unlinked passenger trips, vehicle revenue hours, or number of vehicles. There's a lot, but as long as you're consistent in what you're and how you're reporting it, and you're letting us know, we can figure it out. Okay. The next section of the RR20 is where you are going to report the fare revenues. Fare revenues should include all income received and expended directly from passengers, including donations made on board the vehicle in lieu of a fare. I will say that again in the next one. So fare revenues are further broken down between passenger paid and organization paid. Passenger paid that are those that are traditionally considered passenger fare when the person pays to come on board the vehicle. So again, include the donations received on board of a vehicle in lieu of a fare, and these are separated from the organization paid fares, which are those that an organization pays for or pays through a third party rather than the passenger. So an example of those includes a university paying an agency to allow students to ride fare free. And again, please note that for, as a clarifying that Melissa mentioned earlier, that Medicaid funds will now be reported here this year and going forward. Okay. If you have more than one mode, you are required to capture and report the fares by mode and type of service. There are some exceptions to this requirement as listed here. And if your agency is an exception to the rule, please make sure your analyst is aware of this during validation so we can note it for future years. But as mentioned, much like the operating expenses, the fare revenue should be actuals for each mode of service and not allocated. Going in order of the form, here are some examples of other directly generated funds. In addition, this is where donations and insurance recoveries will be reported along with the non-full cost contracts. So handy dandy list of different other directly generated funds. Revenues accrued through a PT agreement will be reported if you receive revenues from another agency that pays the full cost. Remember, full cost of the service you provide as long as it meets the NTD definition of purchase transportation. Your analyst will discuss the situation with you further if you do report funds to this field. It doesn't usually happen too often in rural, so we like to make sure that it is correct before you proceed. Below the directly generated funding section is the non-federal funding section. You will enter the data accordingly based on what funds came from local funds, state funds, and other non-federal sources. Local funds should include tax levies, general funds, and finances from local entities. State sources should include state programs that support public transit that do not include the Chapter 53 funds that a state may pass through to you. That's very important to note. This will not include the Chapter 53 funds that a state passes through to you. All right. On to the next section, you will select all applicable federal funding sources from a list of the programs. Once you select a box on the left-hand side, additional fields will populate to the right. For 5311 funds passed through from the state, please select the Formula Grants for Rural Areas 5311 box and report those to the FTA Formula Grants for Rural Areas field. It should be the first field on the right. Please note again that the Section 5311 CARES Act funding line is different line item from the named grant. So that's the second one from the bottom if you are a subrecipient. If you are a tribe listening into this, you will report the CARES Act funding on the last line. So depending on what funding sources you receive, that's what you will go ahead and enter on those line items. If you select any of the other fields, it will require a comment to describe the type of funding, and if something else does go, does fit it better, it will tell you whether or not it needs to move. Examples of some other FTA funds will include those not listed, such as the 5308 FTA Clean Fuels Program. Example of other federal funds may include HUD or any other other non-FTA federal sources. And then other U.S. DOT funds will include those from the Federal Highway Administration, FHWA. All right, going on down. After the financial section, you will then enter all resource information, if applicable, to your agency. Please report any resources. Common error is to leave this blank. So if you do not have any volunteer drivers or vehicles, or even safety incidents, fatalities, injuries, make sure that those are all filled out with zeros. If not, you will have to go in and do that before it's submitted. So it will be caught, but it just will be easier if you fill it out. If you want to, as you're filling out your form, fill them out with zeros and save the data, not save and validate, you can do that. That's fine. All right, so underneath the resource area is the service data area. So the miles and hours are reported on this form should only include those that are revenue service, which is when the vehicles are transporting passengers or are able to transport passengers, as mentioned earlier by Melissa. Again, when reporting unlinked passenger trips, passengers should be counted each time they board the vehicle, no matter how many vehicles they use from their origin to their destination. Please note that the total UPT should equal regular UPT plus sponsored UPT. We usually don't use the word regular UPT anymore. It's just we use the umbrella total. So just make sure if you are reporting the unlinked passenger trips as those that are not the sponsored, make sure sponsored plus the regular are in the unlinked passenger trip field. Okay, after completing the revenue section, I will go right back again. Please make sure that your data is broken out by mode and type of service. It should be the actual data as we've been talking about earlier, so just make sure those are all separated out. Okay, back to the safety data. So after completing that revenue service section, the safety data is the last item on the RR20 form. These are the thresholds for reporting safety data on the RR20. If you do not meet any of those thresholds, please make sure that you do enter those zeros, as I mentioned earlier when I was going over resources. All right, so that's the RR20 form. So make sure you save and validate it at the end. If you want to save it as you're going through, that's fine. Or if you want to save and validate, that's fine too. Just make sure that you're saving your data as you go. All right, so if you do not have a group plan sponsor, as I mentioned earlier, and you do have your own TAM plan, you will need to fill out the A90 form, which is performance measures targets. If you have your state as the group plan sponsor, you'll only see a viewable form. You'll not see an editable one within your package. It'll just be below the package. So if this is applicable to you, the A90 is where you'll report the targets for the portion of assets that have met or exceeded their useful life benchmark. This will show the target reported last year, the current performance that is pulled from the current year's asset forms, and have places for you to report your target for the next year. So we're looking at 2021 targets right now. In addition to the targets, you will also upload the narrative report at the bottom, just like last year, as this is a yearly requirement. The narrative will outline any targets your agency set in the form and the progress towards the targets and any changes within the transit system. Again, only group plan sponsor report this form. Subrecipient packages have the viewable version unless you are reporting your own TAM plan, which you will have the editable version. But if you do have questions about the A90, just let us know. Okay, so those are the basic forms for an RGPT, and now we're going to go through some common reporting challenges faced during the annual report. Reporting challenges can include understanding NTD policies, completing data entry correctly, completeness of the entire report, and of course, validation issues. The main challenge stems from the validation that analysts send back the report for. So this occurs when an analyst has questions about the data that was submitted to us. So validation includes but is not limited to time series checks against the prior year data, logic checks between data items on different forms, checks for values outside the range for agencies with similar operating characteristics. So those are the some of the basic ones we're looking at. So your agency can either revise the data to reflect the correct and accurate information, or you will need to provide a sufficient explanation to establish accuracy, and maybe documentation if requested. Usually that doesn't happen, but maybe it would help if you were able to pull documentation. All right, so one issue, as mentioned before, deals with the allocation of operating expenses. Agencies should report those expenses by mode and type of service, so you'll want to determine which expenses are direct and can be easily traced to a particular mode, and which expenses can be shared and then allocated. So we see this pretty commonly. It's getting less and less, though. Another validation is report that you may see is that the year-to-year funding changes and making sure the sources used for public transit are in the correct lines on the RR20. We just want to make sure all funds used to provide public transit are reported, not just the federal funds or the federal plus match. If you had additional funding that was used to support the transit, we want to make sure everything is reported, regardless of source. Okay, as mentioned previously, agencies should only report service data for when you are performing the revenue service. So again, revenue service does not include deadhead, therefore deadhead should not be included in the data that is reported to NTD. So we do see this pretty often, but if you do have this, just try to have it removed from your data when you are submitting it. We want to make sure it is removed so accurate performance indicators like revenue speed and cost per mile are reported. Another common misnomer is the bonds definition and what is included and excluded, which is found right here. So one issue that we find is when an agency reports 100% of the active vehicles on the A30 as bonds instead of just the ones that are being actually used during their peak service. So if they have 10 vehicles but they're only using 6 at the highest peak time of the day, peak time of the year, etc., they should be reporting 6, not the 10. And don't get me wrong, there are times where you have 10 active vehicles and you're using all 10 at peak time. That's fine. You may just have to confirm that for 1 year until the service is established. Another validation issue you may see is when reporting a new vehicle, it is typical that an agency will report the corresponding capital expense on the RR20. So capital expenses are related to purchasing a capital asset like a vehicle or making improvement to a capital asset that increases its value or useful life. So that expense should be those listed there. One validation issue that is found is agencies will enter either the new vehicle or the capital expense, but not both. So, if you're entering a vehicle, there should be an expense for it. Additionally, please note that when you do add a vehicle that is used for more than one mode, you'll want to report the expense to the mode that the vehicle is used most in versus just allocating the cost between the modes. I know it's different from operating, but for the capital, just report it to the mode that it's used most for. And then make sure to add that vehicle to both modes, however, on the A30s. All right. All agencies must inventory all vehicles they use to provide public transit on their A30 that have not been sold or disposed of as of the end of the fiscal year. Hopefully you all still can hear me. Let's see here. The inventory should essentially be a snapshot of the last day of the fiscal year, and the vehicles must be reported in that fiscal year in which they become available for service. So very important to make sure we capture an accurate snapshot of your A30 year to year. All right, after your state DOT does submit the report, there are a couple more steps that need to be taken in order to completely close out the report for the year. So I just went over some, validation, what you may or may not see. So now we're going to kind of move on with validation and the closeout process itself. The assigned analyst to your state will review the entire report for accuracy and consistency. They'll go ahead and compare the data submitted this year to data submitted last year for any significant changes, as well as ensure that all data was reported to the correct field. If there is data change from year to year, please avoid stating general responses like the data is correct or this is what they gave me, and please provide a thorough response and explanation for the change. So the more context, the better, so that way it'll reduce the amount of back and forth between the analyst and you, as well as you and your state. So once the analyst has gone through the report, they'll send it back to the state to resolve the open issues. So each time that happens, the due date timetable is shortened, as there should be fewer issues each time. If you do fail to correct any issues stated in the prior year closeout letter, there may be marked as questionable in the current validation year, and those will be made clear during the validation process. If there is any outstanding items, you'll be asked the validation to confirm whether or not you have, updated or you have correct data for that year. All right, so this is the summary page of the report. We kind of briefly went over it earlier. So right here you can see where you have open issue that will need to be addressed before the submission versus the total issues, which is just the number of issues that fired in a specific form. You'll want to pay attention to the open issues, not necessarily the total issues. The total issues, again, are just ones that, appeared if you hadn't saved all your data yet. So as soon as you start saving more data or you didn't have a data point in there correctly, the open issues will hopefully go down at that point. Okay, so I brought up saving and validating and saving forms throughout the presentation. You can choose to click on the Save button as you go through the form, and you don't have to complete when you don't have the completed data, so the validation issues for the missing data won't necessarily fire. If you do click on Save, the box in the previous page will be red. Once you do save and validate that form, the box will appear green. The goal is to have everything on green, all the forms green, and then 0 open issues. So that is the goal. So you can submit the report. There are 2 ways to view your issues. The first way is to go to the forms with issues, scroll down the page, and then click on View Issues to review them. So form by form, this is an example of the RR20 safety data. So it's a indicator. The other way is to review the issues is from the summary page. So you're going to click on View Issues at the top right-hand corner instead of Annual Forms. This will open up a new page with all the issues listed regardless of the form. So after clicking on View Issues, however you did, the page will appear with the open issues. If you click on the issue line item once, for example, this RR20F024, it will highlight in dark blue. After the issue highlights, you can scroll down the page to review the issue language as well as comment. And then this is what it looks like. So after reviewing the language, you can either comment in the comment box with an explanation and save it, or you may choose to click on View Related Form to make any updates you need to. Or if you're already in the form itself, you can click on Close and you can back out back to the form to make any updates. All right, so validation process through. So now we're going into closeout. So notes in the closeout letter that the state receives will typically relate to incomplete reports, which can mean either the data doesn't conform to NTD definitions, accounting principles, or it could mean that the agency did not adequately respond to validation issues raised by their analysts. All identified issues must be fully addressed in order for the issue to be resolved. If either of these occur, then NTD cites them in the closeout letter, as I mentioned. The best way to resolve validation issues is to provide solid and detailed explanations that give your analyst a clear picture of the service, explained by the data change from year to year, or what service changes took place over the year to cause a significant shift in data. If you do find that last year's data was incorrect and you understand what happened and what the data is, you need to provide the explanation as to why it was wrong and why this year's data is correct, and if possible, provide what last year's data should have been so we can have a solid basis to compare it to the current data. And then just note that that explanation will not be accepted for multiple years, so you may receive a note in the closeout letter, or you might have to request a waiver, etc. All right, so this is the contact information again for our team, as well as the help desk, which is open Monday through Friday, 8 to 7. After closeout, then you're all set for another year, and the analysts will reach out to the state, and then it starts all over again, which is why we're here right now. Thank you again, everyone, for listening, and it looks like everything has been answered right now, but I will turn it over to Lori for the time being, and thank you all.
Thank you. If anybody still has any questions, we'll hang out for a couple of minutes and see if they show up in the Q&A box. So start typing, and we'll get those answered. Nothing comes in, I guess we will wrap it up. Oh, thank you, Sean. Anyone else? Oh, there's a question from Raymond. Can you briefly talk about the narrative?
Sure, I can take that one. So the narrative report, if your agency has your own transit asset management plan, the narrative report is a document that is submitted through the A90 performance measure targets form, and this should review your targets that you set, why you set the targets, and anything that may have affected your progress towards those targets during the fiscal year. There is a template that you can use that's optional, but if you'd like to use it as a guide for your narrative report, that is on the Transit Asset Management website, as well as I believe we have a link to it on the NTD website as well. So I can try to find that and put that in the chat pod in just a moment.
You can probably find it more quickly than I can, so I'll let you do that.
Not a problem.
Thanks. In the meantime, okay, there's an anonymous attendee that is asking if I will summarize the questions and answers and send them. They were just watching the presentation and not the questions and answers. Oops, wait a minute. Okay, so anonymous attendee, you just reminded me that I did not change the default setting where everyone can see the answered questions. So anyone who wants to look back at the ones that were typed, you should now have access to see the other questions. I will see if I can grab the content from the Q&A box. It's an Excel file or Notepad or something, and maybe I can incorporate that with the survey that will go out at the end. So I'm making a note, and hopefully my program coordinator will be able to get that out with both links. There's another question about the narrative.
So for this one, when you guys submit your narrative reports for your TAM plans through the NTD, NTD does not review these or accept them. That's part of the TAM program's review. So in terms of identifying that in your narrative, I would recommend reaching out to the TAM regional contact for information on that. You could include it if it did affect progress towards your transit asset management targets. But it's not something for NTD that we can really speak on because we don't review those or accept those. We act more as a data collector to accept that document through the NTD reporting system, but it's subject to review by the TAM program office.
Thank you, everyone, for participating on this call this afternoon. Call, Zoom, sort of a call. A special thank you to Bailey and Melissa. Great presentation, very informative as always. Everyone who's still listening, you should be getting an email probably tomorrow morning that has a survey link. We really appreciate your input about the presentation, and it helps inform future presentations. It will also have the text from the Q&A box as requested. I have a note. I'm going to do that as soon as we wrap up here. I guess that's it. Everyone be well, be safe, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.